The summer heat was unbearable that Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta, the kind of heat that makes your shirt stick to your back the moment you step outside. David Richardson sat in his silver Mercedes, watching steam rise from under the hood like smoke from a campfire. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. David was used to things going his way. As the owner of 3 successful software companies, he was worth more money than most people could dream of. His life ran like clockwork. Morning coffee at exactly 7, business meetings that always went in his favor, and problems that money could usually solve. But right now, his expensive car had decided to break down in the middle of nowhere, and all his wealth couldn't make it start again. He pulled out his phone to call his personal mechanic, but there were no bars, no signal at all. David looked around at the neighborhood surrounding him. Small apartment buildings lined both sides of the street. Some had broken windows patched with cardboard. Kids played on the sidewalks with bikes that had seen better days. This wasn't the kind of place where a man in a $2,000 suit usually found himself. David stepped out of his car and immediately felt eyes on him. An older man sitting on his porch stopped rocking in his chair to stare. A group of teenagers, playing basketball across the street, paused their game. Everyone seemed to notice the fancy car and the wealthy-looking man who clearly didn't belong there. But nobody approached him. They just watched from a distance, curious but careful. He popped the hood and stared at the engine like it might suddenly explain what was wrong. Steam continued to rise, and David realized he had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. All those years building his business empire, and he'd never learned how to fix a car. He always just paid someone else to handle these problems. 20 minutes passed. The heat was getting worse, and David's expensive shirt was now soaked with sweat. He tried his phone again, walking around the car like some kind of ritual, hoping to catch a signal. Still nothing. The irony wasn't lost on him, that all his technology couldn't help him in this moment. Just as he was considering walking to find help, he heard footsteps behind him. David turned to see a woman approaching from one of the apartment buildings. She looked to be in her 30s, wearing scrubs like the kind hospital workers wear. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she had the kind of tired look that comes from working long hours. "Excuse me," she said, her voice gentle but confident. "I couldn't help but notice you're having car trouble. Are you okay?" David was surprised by her approach. After 20 minutes of people staring at him, from a distance here was someone actually willing to help. He found himself feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment. No, I'm not okay," David said, stumbling over his words. "My car just died on me, and I can't get a signal on my phone to call for help." The woman nodded understandingly. "I'm Nina, by the way. I just got off my shift at the hospital down the road." She walked closer to his car and looked at the steam still coming from under the hood. "Mind if I take a look?" David hesitated for a moment. This wasn't exactly what he was used to. In his world, problems were solved by calling the right person and paying the right price. But here was this nurse still in her work clothes offering to help a complete stranger. And honestly, he didn't have many other options. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure what you could do that I can't," David said, immediately regretting how that sounded. I don't know anything about cars either, so..." Nina smiled, not seeming offended by his words. "My father owned a garage when I was growing up. I spent most of my childhood watching him work on cars. You pick up a few things." She gestured toward the hood. "May I?" David nodded, stepping aside. Nina leaned over the engine, careful not to touch anything that might be hot. She pointed to different parts, explaining what she was seeing. "See this hose here?" she said, indicating a rubber tube near the top of the engine. "It looks like it might have a small tear in it. That's probably why you're losing coolant and overheating." She stood up and wiped her hands on a small towel she'd pulled from her pocket. "The good news is it's not a major repair. The bad news is you can't drive it like this." David stared at her in amazement. In less than 2 minutes, this woman had diagnosed his problem while he'd been standing there helpless for 20 minutes. He felt a strange mix of gratitude and humility that he wasn't used to experiencing. "How did you know that so quickly?" he asked. "Like I said, I grew up around cars. Plus, working in an emergency room teaches you to look for obvious problems first. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. Nina glanced at her watch. There's an auto parts store about 6 blocks from here. They should have a replacement hose, and I can show you how to install it if you want. It's not complicated. David looked down the street in the direction she'd pointed. 6 blocks in this heat in his business suit, to a parts store in a neighborhood he'd never been to before. This day was definitely not going according to plan. But looking at Nina, who had just finished what was probably a long shift at the hospital and was still willing to help a stranger, he felt like he didn't have much choice but to trust her. "That's very kind of you," David said. "But are you sure you have time for this? You just got off work." Nina shrugged. "My grandmother always told me that helping someone in need is never an inconvenience. Besides, it's not like you can just leave your car here overnight. This neighborhood is safe, but a car like yours might attract the wrong kind of attention." David realized she was right. He was completely out of his element, and this woman was offering him exactly the help he needed. Sometimes, he thought, the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. The walk to the auto parts store was unlike anything David had experienced in years. He found himself genuinely talking to someone without any business agenda, without trying to impress anyone or make a deal. Nina walked beside him, pointing out different things in the neighborhood as they went. "That's Mrs. Chen's garden," she said, gesturing to a small plot of vegetables growing between 2 apartment buildings. "She grows enough tomatoes to feed half the block and gives them away to anyone who needs them." Nina smiled. "And that building there? That's where I live. 3rd floor, apartment 3B. David realized he was seeing this neighborhood through completely different eyes now. What had looked run down and unfamiliar from his car window now seemed like a real community, where people knew each other and looked out for one another. It was something he'd lost touch with in his world of luxury condos and private offices. "How long have you lived here?" David asked, genuinely curious. "About 8 years now," Nina replied. "I moved here right after nursing school. The rent was affordable and it's close to the hospital. I always planned to move somewhere fancier once I saved enough money. But honestly, I love it here. The people are real." When they reached the auto parts store, David felt completely out of his element again. The store was small and cramped, with car parts stacked on shelves that reached the ceiling. The smell of motor oil and rubber filled the air. A man behind the counter looked up as they entered, his face breaking into a warm smile when he saw Nina. "Hey there, Nina. How's your day going?" the man called out. "Not bad, Tommy. Just helping this gentleman with his car troubles," Nina replied, leading David toward the back of the store where the hoses were kept. David watched as Nina examined different hoses, comparing sizes and checking part numbers with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She held up different options, explaining the differences between them in terms he could actually understand. "This one's a bit more expensive, but it'll last longer," she said, showing him a reinforced hose. "This cheaper one will work fine too, but you might have to replace it again in a year or 2. She looked at him with a slightly amused expression. "Though I'm guessing cost isn't your biggest concern right now." David had to laugh at that. "You're right about that. Let's go with the better one." As they walked back to his car, David found himself asking Nina about her work at the hospital. Her face lit up as she talked about her patients, the challenges of working in the emergency room and the satisfaction of helping people during their worst moments. "It's not always easy," she admitted. "We see a lot of difficult cases, and the hours are long. But when you can make a real difference in someone's life, when you can help a family through a crisis, it makes everything worth it." David was struck by the passion in her voice. He tried to remember the last time he'd felt that way about his work. Building his companies had been exciting at first, but somewhere along the way it had become more about the money and less about the actual impact. Back at his car, Nina opened the hood again and began working on the engine. David watched in fascination as she carefully removed the damaged hose and prepared to install the new one. Her movements were precise and confident, and she explained each step as she went. "The trick is to make sure the clamps are tight enough to prevent leaks, but not so tight that they damage the hose," she said. adjusting the metal clamps with a small tool she'd borrowed from Tommy's store. My dad used to say that fixing cars is like performing surgery. You have to be gentle but firm. Your father sounds like he was a wise man, David said. Nina's expression softened. He was. He passed away 5 years ago. But I still hear his voice every time I work on something like this. He taught me that there's dignity in all kinds of work, whether you're fixing cars or saving lives. The important thing is doing it well and helping people when you can. As Nina finished the repair, David realized something had shifted inside him. This woman, who had every reason to walk past his expensive car and ignore his problems, had instead gone out of her way to help him. She'd spent her own time, shared her knowledge, and treated him with kindness despite the obvious differences in their circumstances. There, Nina said, stepping back from the engine. That should hold you. The engine needs to cool down a bit more before you start it, but this repair should get you wherever you need to go. David looked at the engine, then at Nina. Her scrubs were now stained with a bit of grease and she had a small smudge of dirt on her cheek, but she was smiling with satisfaction at a job well done. I don't know how to thank you, David said, and he meant it sincerely. You've gone above and beyond for a complete stranger. Nina shrugged, wiping her hands on the towel again. Like I said, my grandmother taught me that helping others is never an inconvenience. Besides, you seem like a good person who just had some bad luck today. David found himself wondering how she could be so sure he was a good person. They'd just met and he hadn't exactly made the best first impression with his initial hesitation about accepting her help. But there was something about Nina's ability to see the best in people that made him want to be better than he was. Can I at least, pay you for your time and expertise? David asked, reaching for his wallet. Nina held up her hand. Absolutely not. I didn't help you for money. I helped you because it was the right thing to do. She glanced at her watch. The engine should be cool enough now. Let's see if she starts. David turned the key, and the Mercedes roared to life, purring smoothly as if nothing had ever been wrong. He couldn't help but smile at the sound. David felt relief wash over him as his car engine purred back to life. The sound he usually took for granted now seemed like the most beautiful thing in the world. But as Nina stepped back from the hood, wiping her hands clean one final time, something caught his eye that made his heart stop completely. On her right hand, Nina wore a ring that David recognized instantly. It wasn't just any ring. The emerald stone was surrounded by tiny diamonds in a setting that was both elegant and unique. David felt his breath catch in his throat as memories came flooding back like a movie playing in his mind. He remembered being 7 years old, sitting in his grandmother's living room, mesmerized by that exact same ring as she told him stories. The ring would catch the light from the old lamp beside her favorite chair, casting little green sparkles on the wall. His grandmother, Eleanor, would twist it around on her finger when she was thinking, and David would watch those sparkles dance. That ring, David said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Where did you get that ring? Nina looked down at her hand, and her expression immediately changed. The confident, capable woman who had just fixed his car now looked vulnerable, almost protective. She instinctively pulled her hand closer to her chest. This ring? She asked, her voice cautious. Why do you want to know? David realized how his question must have sounded. Here he was, a wealthy stranger in an expensive suit, asking a woman he'd just met about her jewelry. In this neighborhood, that probably seemed suspicious at best and threatening at worst. I'm sorry, David said quickly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. It's just that I've seen that ring before. I think I know where it came from. Nina's eyes narrowed slightly. She clearly wasn't sure whether to trust him or not. David couldn't blame her. If someone had approached him on the street asking about his watch or his cufflinks, he'd be suspicious too. Look, David continued, I know this sounds crazy, but I think that ring belonged to my grandmother. Her name was Eleanor Richardson. She lived about 10 miles from here in Buckhead. The moment David said his grandmother's name, Nina's entire demeanor changed. Her eyes went wide, and she took a small step backward, as if she'd seen a ghost. The protective stance she'd taken with her hand relaxed, and she stared at David with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Eleanor Richardson?" Nina repeated, her voice filled with wonder. "Mrs. Eleanor from the community center? The woman who used to volunteer here every Tuesday and Thursday?" Now it was David's turn to be shocked. "You knew my grandmother?" Nina's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at the ring on her finger as if seeing it for the first time. "She wasn't just someone I knew," Nina said, her voice thick with emotion. "She saved my life." David felt the world tilt slightly around him. This couldn't be happening. The chances of this encounter, of this woman wearing his grandmother's ring, of her actually knowing Eleanor seemed impossible. But looking at Nina's face, seeing the genuine emotion there, he knew it was real. "How?" David asked. "How did you know her?" Nina sat down on the curb next to his car, still staring at the ring. David sat down beside her, forgetting all about his expensive suit or the dirty pavement. Nothing else seemed to matter in that moment. "I was 17, Nina began, her voice distant as she traveled back in memory. "My mom was working 3 jobs just to keep food on our table and pay rent. I was a good student, but I had no idea how I was going to afford college, let alone nursing school. I used to go to the community center after school because it was free, and they had computers I could use for homework." She twisted the ring around her finger, just like David remembered his grandmother doing. The gesture was so familiar it made his chest tight with emotion. Mrs. Eleanor was there every week, helping kids with their homework, organizing activities, just being there for anyone who needed someone to talk to. She was this elegant white lady who could have been anywhere else, but she chose to be there, with us. And she wasn't just visiting to feel good about herself, she really cared. David could picture it perfectly. His grandmother had always been like that, finding ways to help people without making them feel like charity cases. She had a gift for making everyone feel valued and important. When I told her I wanted to be a nurse but couldn't afford school, she didn't just offer to help with money, Nina continued. She sat down with me and we made a plan. She helped me apply for scholarships, drove me to job interviews, and when I still came up short on tuition, she quietly covered the difference, but she made me promise to pay it forward someday. Nina looked up at David and he could see the deep gratitude and love she still felt for his grandmother after all these years. The day I graduated from nursing school, she gave me this ring. She said it had been in her family for generations and she wanted me to have it as a reminder that I was part of her family now. She told me to wear it whenever I needed to remember that someone believed in me. David felt tears starting to form in his own eyes. This was exactly the kind of thing his grandmother would do. She had always said that the best investment you could make was in another person's potential. She died about 3 years ago, David said quietly. I was at her funeral, but there were so many people there. I had no idea how many lives she had touched. Nina nodded. I was there too. I sat in the back because I felt like I didn't belong, with all the fancy people in the front rows. But I needed to say goodbye to the woman who changed everything for me. David and Nina sat in silence for a moment, both trying to process what had just happened. The summer heat seemed less oppressive now, as if the weight of this discovery had somehow made everything else fade into the background. David watched as Nina continued to twist the ring around her finger, and he could almost hear his grandmother's voice telling him that everything happens for a reason. I can't believe this, David finally said, shaking his head in amazement. Of all the places my car could have broken down, of all the people who could have helped me, it had to be you. Nina looked at him with fresh eyes, as if she was seeing him for the first time. You're really her grandson, Mrs. Eleanor's David? She used to talk about you all the time. She talked about me? David asked, surprised. He had always assumed his grandmother's volunteer work was completely separate from her family life. Oh yes, Nina said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She was so proud of you. She would tell everyone about her grandson who was building these amazing computer companies. She said you were brilliant with technology, that you could solve any problem if you put your mind to it. David felt a pang of guilt. While his grandmother was bragging about his business success to the people she mentored, he had been so caught up in his own world that he rarely asked her about her volunteer work. He knew she spent time at the community center, but he had never really understood what that meant to her or to the people she helped. "I wish I had known about you back then," David said honestly. "I mean, I knew she volunteered, but I never realized how much she was actually doing for people. She never really talked about it at family dinners." Nina nodded knowingly. That was just her way. She didn't help people so she could tell stories about it later. She helped because she genuinely cared, and she always made us feel like we were doing her a favor by letting her be part of our lives, not the other way around. As they continued talking, David began to understand just how deep his grandmother's impact had been on this community. Nina told him about other kids Mrs. Eleanor had helped over the years. There was Carlos, who was now a teacher because she helped him get into college. There was Keisha, who became a social worker after Mrs. Eleanor showed her how one person could make a difference in so many lives. There was James, who opened his own auto repair shop after Mrs. Eleanor helped him get into a trade program. "She didn't just give us money or opportunities," Nina explained. "She gave us something more valuable than that. She gave us the belief that we mattered, that our dreams were worth pursuing, that we deserved good things in life." David thought about his own relationship with his grandmother. She had always been loving and supportive, but he realized now that he had taken that support for granted. It had never occurred to him that not everyone had someone in their corner the way he did. For Nina and the other kids she mentored, his grandmother had been that person. "She used to say something that stuck with me all these years," Nina continued. "She would tell us that success isn't about how much money you make or how famous you become. She said real success is measured by how many people are better off because you existed." Those words hit David like a punch to the stomach. By his grandmother's definition, was he successful? Sure, he had money and businesses and all the trappings of what most people would call success. But how many people were actually better off? Because he existed? He employed people, which was something, but beyond that, what was his real impact on the world? "The night before my nursing school graduation," Nina said, "Mrs. Eleanor took me out to dinner at this fancy restaurant downtown. I had never been anywhere like that before, and I was so nervous about using the wrong fork or saying something embarrassing." David could picture his grandmother doing exactly that, making sure Nina felt comfortable and celebrated. "But she made me feel like I belonged there, like I deserved to be in that beautiful place. And then she gave me this ring." Nina held up her hand, letting the emerald catch the late afternoon sunlight. "She told me it had belonged to her mother and her grandmother before that. She said she was giving it to me because I had become like family to her." David remembered that ring from his childhood, remembered his grandmother telling him stories about the strong women in their family who had worn it. The fact that she had chosen to pass it on to Nina instead of keeping it in the biological family said everything about how she felt about this young woman. "She made me promise her something that night," Nina continued, her voice growing soft with the memory. "She made me promise that whenever I looked at this ring, I would remember that someone believed in me completely. And she made me promise that I would do the same thing for someone else someday." "Have you?" David asked. "Kept that promise?" Nina smiled. "I try to. There's a teenage girl in my building, Destiny, whose mom works nights. I help her with her homework sometimes, and I've been talking to her about college applications. She wants to be a doctor. And there's this young man at the hospital, Anthony, who works in maintenance but dreams of becoming a nurse. I've been encouraging him to apply to the program." David realized that his grandmother's legacy was living on, through Nina, that the kindness and support that had changed Nina's life was now changing other lives. It was like a chain of goodness that his grandmother had started, and it was continuing to grow and spread. "You know what the strangest part is?" David said, looking at Nina with newfound respect and understanding. "I came from money. I had every advantage, every opportunity handed to me. But I think my grandmother taught you lessons about life that she never taught me." Nina looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe she knew you'd learn them when you were ready. Maybe that's why we're sitting here right now." The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but neither David nor Nina seemed in any hurry to leave. They had been talking for over an hour, sharing stories about Eleanor and discovering connections they never knew existed. David felt like he was seeing his grandmother through completely new eyes, understanding her in ways he never had when she was alive. "You know," David said, "I feel like I owe you an apology." Nina looked at him curiously. "For what?" "When my car first broke down and you offered to help, I hesitated. I made assumptions about this neighborhood, about the people here. I was wrong, and I'm sorry for that." Nina smiled gently. "I could tell you were nervous. But you know what? You still accepted my help. A lot of people in your position would have called a cab and left their car here rather than trust someone like me. The fact that you stayed, that you were willing to learn something new, that tells me who you really are." David thought about that. He had stayed even though everything in his usual world would have told him to leave. Maybe there was hope for him yet. "My grandmother would have been proud of you today," Nina continued. "She always said that the measure of a person isn't where they start, it's how willing they are to grow." As they sat there, David found himself thinking about his life in a way he hadn't in years. His businesses were successful, but what was he really building? His grandmother had used her resources to change lives, to give people hope and opportunities. What was he doing with his advantages? "Nina," David said slowly, "what if I told you I wanted to do something to honor my grandmother's memory? Something that would continue the work she started?" Nina's eyes lit up with interest. "What did you have in mind?" David took a deep breath, an idea forming that felt both scary and exciting. "What if we started a scholarship program? Not just any scholarship, but one that works the way my grandmother worked. We don't just give money and walk away. We mentor the students, support them through school, help them build the confidence they need to succeed." "That sounds amazing," Nina said, "but something like that would cost a lot of money." David smiled. "I have a lot of money, more than I know what to do with, honestly. But I don't have what you have. I don't have the connections in this community, the trust, the understanding of what people really need. I don't have the heart for this kind of work that my grandmother had." "You're wrong about that," Nina said firmly. "You do have the heart for it. I can see it. You wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation if you didn't care." They spent the next hour planning, their excitement growing with every idea. David would provide the funding, but Nina would help design the program and identify students who needed support. They would focus on nursing and healthcare programs first, but eventually expand to help kids pursue any dream that would make their communities better. "We should call it the Eleanor Richardson Foundation," David suggested. "She would have hated that," Nina laughed. "She never liked having her name on things." "What about the Second Chance Foundation? She always said everyone deserves a second chance to show the world what they're capable of." David loved it. It was perfect. As they worked out more details, David realized something had changed inside him. For the first time in years, he felt excited about something that wasn't about making more money or growing his companies. He felt like he had found a purpose that actually mattered. "There's something else," David said. "The community center where my grandmother volunteered. I want to help renovate it, expand their programs. And I want to do it the right way, working with the community, not just throwing money at it and walking away." Nina nodded enthusiastically. "The center could definitely use help. The computers are ancient, the roof leaks, and they can barely afford to keep the lights on. But the people who run it are amazing. Mrs. Rodriguez has been the director for 15 years, and she knows every family in this neighborhood." As the evening grew darker, David realized he needed to head home. But he didn't want this conversation to end. He pulled out his business card and handed it to Nina. "This has been the most important day I've had in years," he said. "I want to start working on this foundation right away. Would you be willing to partner with me on this?" Nina looked at the business card, then back at David. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "More serious than I've ever been about anything," David replied. Nina stood up and brushed the dust off her scrubs. "Then yes, I'm in, but I have one condition." "What's that?" "We do this the way Mrs. Eleanor would have done it. We don't just help people, we believe in them. We don't just give them opportunities. We show them they deserve those opportunities." David stood up too, and extended his hand. Deal. As they shook hands, David felt like his life was finally starting to make sense. He had spent years building companies and making money, thinking that was what success looked like. But sitting on this curb, planning a foundation with a nurse who embodied everything his grandmother had tried to teach him, he understood what real success actually meant. 6 months later, the Second Chance Foundation gave out its first scholarships to 12 students from the neighborhood. Nina had left her apartment and moved to a small house nearby, but she still lived in the same community, still worked at the same hospital, still helped her neighbors whenever they needed it. David had learned to balance his business responsibilities with his foundation work, and he found that both made him happier than he had ever been. He visited the community center every week, sometimes helping with tutoring, sometimes just talking to kids about their dreams. And every time Nina looked at the emerald ring on her finger, she remembered Mrs. Eleanor's words about success being measured by how many people are better off because you existed. She smiled, knowing that both she and David were finally living up to that standard, and that Eleanor's legacy would continue to grow and touch new lives for generations to come.